one of the hadith here is about how you're always supposed to say Assalamu alaikum and respond to it. So thank you for the experts in the field of greetings here who didn't need the hadith. But, I'm trying to put that one more into practice now. But really, it's wonderful, as always, to be down here and see so many new and familiar faces. And I think it's been a little over a year since I've been back, although I promise you a really interesting talk next spring with the whole artwork that we'll work with, but inshallah. But we've been delaying a little bit because al-Farah, we hope that she will be coming soon. I guess she's been caught in traffic, and obviously some more people as well. I passed out, partly to keep you occupied before we get started, some translated hadith with a little contextual explanation about them, because I'm not going to read these, we'll just have a discussion based on them, but as always at this gathering, it's the discussion that's most interesting because of what everyone has to contribute. I understand that this, just a couple things, there's a lot to take in terms of what I'm going to say by way of introduction, and also by way of these hadith handouts. If you lose yours or want to keep it or somehow need to get it again, Farhad, you're going to try and, will you try and put this online along with the actual recording then?
Yep.
And so please don't be shy when you're talking. I know I'm pretty used to being recorded, but we want everybody to share. Please come on across. We haven't started really yet. So, yeah, so is there anything, is she just arriving now?
Yes.
Let's hold off and starting until she gets here then. And but this handout we will come to after about a half hour by introduction, and then we'll start the discussion of some of these hadith and handouts. So that's all. She's saying to go ahead.
Yeah, she can hear it from upstairs.
Oh, okay, well, very good then. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is, because the title, I saw an interesting internet exchange about what does he mean by souls/selves. I would add breaths as well, because although anfus, it could be yourself or your souls, it can also, the word like nefesh in Hebrew means, is from the same root for breaths as well. So let me start with the Quranic verse that I'll read to you in translation in just a moment, which you'll see why it's relevant to everything to be said today. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَءُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ وَإِن تَوَلَّوْا فَقُلْ حَسْبِيَ اللَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ عَلَيْهِ تَوَكَّلْتُ وَهُوَ رَبُّ الْعَرْشِ الْعَظِيمُ. Okay, the first of these two verses, actually at the end of Surah At-Tawbah, just the English translation. Already, laqad, there has come to you, surely come to you all, the plural, a messenger from your own souls. Dear to him is what troubles you, deeply concerned for you, cherishing and loving those who have faith. Again, that's the 128th ayah of Surah At-Tawbah. The subject of today's talk is the pedagogical and spiritual challenge of discovering and then communicating the deeper dimensions of the Sirah, and particularly of the Hadith that are its richest and most complex historical component. That inner process of moving from the outermost, strictly historicist perception of the Hadith toward an awakening to the ever deeper spiritual dimensions of the prophetic teaching and example is beautifully expressed in the famous final verses of Surah At-Tawbah, whose deeper significance I only began to suspect on two outwardly chance occasions many years ago. First, while I was trying to decipher these ayahs on the tiled walls of a ruined 19th century Sufi majlis we were visiting outside of Marrakesh, and then later while listening to an extraordinary recording of a Jarahi Sufi majlis session of dhikr in Istanbul. It was an LP, so that will tell you at least how long ago it was. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
What prompts me to take up this topic at this time, though, is the recurrent pedagogical challenge of teaching young students who have nowadays often lost touch for readily understandable reasons with many of the traditional, customary ritual, devotional, and poetic or musical humanistic vehicles that for centuries have so deeply and imperceptibly conveyed the deeper inner meanings and lessons of the Sirah. It will become obvious, I hope, that many of these same challenges carry over readily to the comparable situations of other religious traditions today as well. So part one, from the outward to the inner in our awareness of Hadith and Sirah. Perhaps I can begin to evoke some of the key stages and basic principles leading from the outward and highly problematic literalism, the Zawahir, to an ever deeper spiritual understanding, the Batin, in our appreciation of Hadith, by following some of the stages of my own path of discovery, not least because any specific courses actually devoted to Hadith were as absent from my own professional academic formation as the Hadith themselves were from my own childhood and youth. Like most young students of Islamic studies without any other cultural and ritual traditions surrounding the Hadith to start with, I first encountered the Hadith in academic settings, that is in books, from the perspective of earlier generations of historians and philologists who tended to simply reject the whole corpus of Hadith en bloc, either as historically inauthentic, or else, that's in quote marks, or else as much later fabrications. At the same time, in the course of my initiation into each of the Islamic religious and rational sciences, as well as the wider Islamic humanities, I was constantly encountering short citations or allusions to recurrent intradisciplinary and fairly closed sets of related hadith that served as rhetorically persuasive justifications of each Muslim author's pre-existing intellectual perspectives and understandings. After a while, as the particular context of those different learned intellectual traditions were filled in, students quickly come to recognize this common use of hadith as familiar plug-in leitmotifs across the centuries. For example, for the traditions of Islamic philosophy, Ibn Rushd's famous Kitab al-Fasl al-Maqal, Usul al-Fiqh and Kalam, ethical teaching, for example, Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulumuddin, and poetic and prose works of spiritual awakening and guidance, such as Rumi's Masnavi and its multitude of predecessors and later imitators. Another, much more deeply rooted dimension of the living hadith, which I only recognized as such after graduate school, as I was obliged in my teaching and research to read more widely in the hadith collections, was encountered in all those ritual and devotional contexts that I had first met during youthful travels in Morocco, Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkey. These profound existential echoes and evocations of hadith would include, for example, the customary observances of Ramadan, Laylatul Qadr, or indeed the traditional forms and rituals of Salat itself, emotionally charged celebrations of the Miraj, Mabath, the mission of the Prophet, and Milad, the birth of the Prophet, accompanied by unforgettable music, poetry, and choral singing of the Burda, Ibn al-Farid, and other qasidas praising the Prophet, who understand in all of these as the Haqiqa Muhammadiyah. The wide, just continuing with some of those other ritual and humanistic vehicles for the Hadith, the wide popularity of familiar, long-standing Arba'in collections, that's 40 carefully selected Hadith, such as Nawawi's in particular, and a related Arabic calligraphy highlighting, usually as domestic wall art today, especially significant individual Hadith, or the striking intrusion in different circumstances of everyday life, of a sudden chorus of unexpected invocations and blessings, salawat on Muhammad and the Al Muhammad, the people of Muhammad. So more painfully and unforgettably, I'm also reminded here of several difficult, albeit ultimately educational, occasions of unconscious and unintentional, at least, bad adab during my youthful travels, such as walking in front of someone praying, or eating with my left hand, or wearing a gold ring, where I was merely informed, often in harsh terms, of the relevant points of sunnah, based on hadith unknown to me at the time, that I had just so egregiously violated in public. Yet among my own academic teachers, only Anna Marie Schimmel, yes, come on, don't worry, come on, fast, there are 3 more seats over here. Only Anna Marie Schimmel attempted to convey something of the omnipresence and deeper significance of those ritualized evocations of the Sirah and Hadith, especially in her uniquely rich volume on the popular veneration of the Prophet Muhammad. Though in many ways, at that time, her writings were largely unappreciated, at least by the more bookish of her graduate students. Then, long after my formal schooling, began the slow intermediate discovery through the mediation of graduate students, travels with friends and colleagues, and more direct human encounters of traditional representatives of the living oral tradition of Hadith. These memorable meetings with those whom one might call living Hadith, and here I'm thinking of the model of those poignant living books whom we meet at the very end, Great Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, were through individual teachers who were transmitting and practicing the deeper realities of Hadith, primarily by their example and inspiration, rarely with any explicit mention of either the Hadith or Quranic sources underlying their personal teaching and examples. Here I was reminded of the traditional majlis of direct Hadith transmission and study described by one of my doctoral students working in Bahrain, where the students, who were themselves respected middle-aged religious scholars, would stop for full prayers and blessings on each preceding human link of the long isnad down to the present day, so that at most in one majlis they might reach and discuss in that session the actual text or matan of a single hadith. Yet what was really being evoked and discovered through that lengthy process of prayer and shared evocation and blessings was not just that single short hadith, but rather the living presence of its source. Eventually, in the course of the accidents of shifting professional and research interests, I slowly began to notice the repeated strange centrality of the Mohammedan reality, the Hakika Muhammadiyah, which goes by many other names, Insan, Kamal, Aqla, Nur, and so on. Only the most common among a host of related names and symbols for this reality. That is, of that mysterious messenger from your souls with which this talk began. Here, in various symbolic guises and settings, was the explicit focus and center point of so many lastingly influential forms of Islamic theology, philosophy, irfan, and related practices and devotions, including those I just mentioned, throughout the most widespread pre-colonial Muslim cultures from West Africa to Indonesia. And simultaneously, together with many colleagues and students, I began to recognize the presence and inspiration of Hadith throughout the wider Islamic humanities, both in the literary adabiyat of so many vernacular Muslim languages, and in endlessly diverse related customs and teachings, intimately tied to particular local ritual contexts and conditions, most often among groups and formerly illiterate individuals, usually not immediately conscious of the profound inspirational role of Hadith. Yes, at least one place over here. Fine. Underlying those practices and devotions. Second point, pedagogical and creative challenges in contemporary circumstances. Today's talk is basically an essay in preparation for deeper reading and study, a sort of take-home assignment. Here's the take-home material. Hence the handout of these related selected translations, with no pretense of providing easily formulated answers or prescriptions. For many in this audience are well aware, in our interactions with students and perhaps even our children and grandchildren, or at least with their wider generations, of the concrete particular obstacles that we all must encounter in attempting to awaken them to a deeper understanding and appreciation of the depths and contemporary spiritual importance of central religious traditions, such as the Hadith and Sirah in this context, although the same considerations carry over to communicating about any religious tradition. For today, students initially almost automatically tend to approach these traditions in light of familiar modern illusions and historic assumptions of a straightforward literalism, and perhaps more existentially, of a vague longing for the elements of an even more simplistic socio-political ideology. What do the Hadith tell us to do, not to do? Of course, those most basic challenges of spiritual pedagogy and discovering the effective new means, the necessarily creative communication of religious tradition, are by now universal ones in our day. So the lessons we do eventually learn in wrestling with these challenges posed by the understanding and sharing of the Hadith are likely to carry over into other areas of both Islamic tradition and other traditions as well. First, a couple of further qualifications. We're not attempting here to take up the long-debated perennial questions, both in modern scholarship and indeed in traditional religious disciplines of ilm al-Hadith, of the authenticity of the Hadith and their isnads, whether involving particular sayings or the immense corpus of Hadith collections more generally. Secondly, for the purposes of this introduction, for a broad general audience, I've drawn almost all of my supporting illustrations in today's handout from the long sections on adab, on proper spiritual attitude and corresponding behavior, primarily taken from the Sahih collections of Bukhari and Muslim. The translations I use are from a pretty good translation of Mishkat al-Masavi, Volume 2 of Robson's translations, but they're almost all from Bukhari and Muslim. Whatever judgments individuals might make about the hadith included in these adab sources, they offer fewer obvious motives for the sorts of political, tribal, ideological, and other recurrent biases connected with many other standard hadith topics and chapters. And more importantly, those familiar hadith on adab, together with the following selections from the Mishkat on sayings connected with softening or spiritually sensitizing the heart, were particularly influential and representative throughout the development of all these later Islamic learned traditions and vernacular literatures of ethics, devotion, and spiritual guidance that remain profoundly rooted in the practice and teachings of the Prophet. Third part of the introduction, what is needed to discover the hadith as awakenings, as a kind of vertical, immediate connection to the messenger from our souls. By now, almost everyone is rather painfully aware, through the recent bombardment of media citations from extremist politicians and ideologues of every stripe, of the bizarre, often highly destructive and offensive misunderstandings that are readily possible whenever someone ignorantly encounters some random passage of an English or other translated version of the Quran without any of the essential interpretive background and necessary contextual orientation. Fortunately, in the case of the Quran, we do now have an increasing body of accessible popular literature and helpful guidance, particularly the recent study Quran, specifically designed to provide that kind of solitary context and carefully informed orientation for novice, well-meaning readers obliged to rely on popular English translations. However, that is not yet the case for the Hadith, where, despite a recent proliferation of pioneering, struggling English translations, often apparently designed mainly to accompany or introduce the Arabic text for study in traditional religious classrooms and madrasas, the level of translation in those instances where complete versions or even exist, and of corresponding indispensable contextualization is often problematic, typically expressed in an English, quotes, that actually presupposes a prior awareness with the underlying Arabic and constant Quranic allusions, which aren't explained. So the following observations can be taken as brief reminders based on some years' experience in teaching English Hadith translations to complete beginners of important considerations that can serve to open well-motivated new readers to a deeper appreciation of the Hadith that is our purpose concern here today. It is likely that almost all of these following considerations will be obvious to those who have fortunately encountered the Hadith within the nurturing and guiding context of a complex living tradition. But for the most part, these observations are usually anything but obvious to beginning readers raised in today's global digital culture. So there's a few points here that I'll just mention very briefly. Most obviously, the prophetic hadith, whether the standard Sunni or Shiite collections, presuppose in their readers and hearers a comprehensive, fully integrated awareness of the deeper Quranic vision that is almost always informing the Prophet's words in original Arabic and symbolic vocabulary. This is one important dimension of Aisha's famous observation concerning the Prophet, that his very character, his very nature was the Quran, kana khuluquhu al-Quran. This constantly present background web of interrelated Quranic ideas, symbols, and teachings involves much more than just connecting with those obviously pertinent ayahs where a particular hadith may visibly serve to translate or more concretely communicate a specific Quranic lesson. Indeed, the vast number of hadith can best be understood as readily accessible illustrations or applications. I should have done this at the beginning. Things are much clearer now. Spiritual principles more broadly or implicitly expressed in the Quran. Just as parents, teachers, and preachers in any religious tradition are constantly reminding their respective audiences of the essential need to practice and apply principles that they may hopefully already know in their general scriptural form. Thus the chapters on adab and the Hadith collections, for example. In those, this is just one example. The dozens of Hadith criticizing more particular forms of ostentation, the use of silk or gold or rich embroidery, pride, gossip, slander, feelings of superiority, and so on, all bear this obvious relation between the Hadith to underlying Quranic principles. Secondly, the Hadith on virtually all subjects present a constant need to adjust appropriately for an attentive, accurate awareness of the actual particular historical, social, economic, and cultural context of the original Hadith in order to grasp the deeper guiding principles being applied in those particular local contexts and situations. Those contexts include not only the nascent Medinan Muslim and quote-unquote in small m and surrounding Arab and Bedouin communities of the Prophet's own time, but also the ways that the earliest Hadith transmitters are often in fact aiming their reports of prophetic sayings as pointed lessons and teachings within the radically different circumstances and challenges suddenly created by the earlier conquest, civil wars, fitan, and beyond in the early Umayyad period. The lack of such essential, deeper contextual insights can lead to misleading and problematic consequences whenever students fail to adjust for those implicit ambient circumstances in light of the underlying ethical and spiritual principles informing each saying, as they were originally expressed in particular, and today in often extremely unfamiliar economic, social, and customary situations. To take one important example, and one hopefully less controversial than the obvious recurrent matters of assumed gender, family, tribal, social, and economic relations of the Prophet's own day, the recurrent Hadith phrase, "your brother Muslim," which is in hundreds of the Hadith when somebody's being addressed about how they should behave, is usually contrasting the unfamiliar demands of the new ethical Medinan community of the Muslimun, the followers of the Prophet, with the familiar old tribal or Meccan mores of the Jahiliyyah. Understanding that will yield radically different meanings if it is unconsciously contrasted instead with the other ambient monotheisms of that time and region, that is, in reading Muslim there with an implicit capital M. As we gradually learn from experience, the ideal corrective to so many otherwise almost unavoidable misunderstandings of Hadith is serious contact with a living, personally better known exemplar of a friend of God, a Wali Allah, like those rare, unforgettable individuals mentioned several times in the Hadith, to the effect that when you see such a person, you see or are reminded of God. One central feature of the actual full Hadith, which are typically much more complex and particular than their simplified, more familiar mnemonic versions repeated throughout later Islamic literatures, is that they are usually challenging personal mini-dramas that combine the particular character, personality, and governing assumptions of the Prophet's interlocutor or interlocutors, the perspectives, often in later contexts, and retellings of the transmitter of the Hadith, who's not at all necessarily the person who was originally spoken to, the particular challenges of each specific situation, whether those be implicit or explicit, that give rise to that basic original question and the prophetic response, and the Prophet's instructive insight and carefully tailored words intended for that particular person, with their unique character and situation. It took a lot of words to say that, so let me be just very concrete about, it's nice that you're actually recording this, but we've all had the experience of, it doesn't really matter whether it's a highly spiritual setting like here or a lecture at a university or whatever, but you've all had the experience of going to that and being there and then listening to what somebody else says afterwards about what was said. And you have to say, astaghfirullah, God forbid, that person should have stayed home. They're just spreading evil. This happens all the time in universities. It's not just in Sufi majlises or whatever, but it's like you can get beyond that in the Hadith, but it's actually amazingly how well they're constructed in such a way that you can get beyond that. The Prophet said X, If you know nothing about the context and who he said it to and what the situation is, there's no way that you're going to actually understand what is recorded. And we're very familiar with that in oral situations, in oral teaching, but it's really amazing how effective the Hadith are, for that matter, how the Gospels are, despite both of them being oral literatures before they were written down. So, for example, among the Hadith and Adab, there are several fairly long Hadith reported by a no doubt much older and deeply experienced Aisha, recounting how she, as a much younger woman, wife of the Prophet, couldn't understand how and why the Prophet could be so personally friendly and accommodating with particular visiting individuals of whom he had earlier expressed such a low or problematic opinion. Of course, at 13 or 15 or whatever, she's not going to see the farsightedness of why the Prophet is meeting with and discussing with such unfriendly people who, in almost all cases, eventually became Muslims. Another even more striking example of these complex dramatic dimensions of the original Hadith, which originally enticed me into the closer study of Hadith and Sirah, was when I first discovered Bukhari's mini Hadith in his section on voluntary fasting, that is on Selves, fasting outside of Ramadan, which relate how the Prophet gave radically different, highly individualized answers to a wide range of requests from individuals hoping to take up the spiritual discipline of very different types of regular voluntary fasting. Some people the same day every week, one day a month, perpetual fasting. Everybody had different ideas of what would be a good spiritual discipline for them. Again, it reminds me of sitting with Sufi teachers and all the tell me what to do kind of questions. But Bukhari, and by the way, if you haven't read the books of Hadith, the chapters are all filled, and this is the canonical, filled with apparently contradictory sayings and responses. This would be a good example but what I remembered when I read it was one response in which the Prophet pointedly reminded one questioner, these are all people eager to take up extra fasting, to take account of how his desired form of fasting would unduly add to his wife's burdens of cooking and food preparation, and he didn't bother to mention the other familiar difficulties that arise from repeated fasting. That is, how good-natured and friendly do we become in fasting? There may be people here who have just done 24 hours of Yom Kippur, for that matter, but generally it's not good for interpersonal relations. Not maybe interpersonal relations with higher powers, but with other people. That incident is one of many similar cases in the Hadith and Sirah in which one can see the direct inspiration for what was eventually to become so widely institutionalized in the multiple later roles of the spiritual guide, the Shaykh, Pir, Murshid, and so on. Another point. As one reads the Hadith and Adab in particular, one cannot but be struck by the way that they almost all seem to assume the uniquely intense and familiar family context of the small, nascent Medina community, only a few thousand people perhaps, along with the exiles and immigrants' connections there with their family members who have remained behind in Mecca or in Abyssinia or elsewhere. In other words, the advice of these Hadith typically assumes the revelatory intimacy and entanglement of long mutual acquaintance. Let me repeat that again. The revelatory intimacy and entanglement of long mutual acquaintance, and of each actor's ongoing spiritually educational interpersonal interactions that we, at least until quite recently, might have associated with the enforced intimacy of a small, isolated village or a particularly close, extended family. But who has such revealingly intimate, yet unavoidably socially visible and long-standing personal interactions in the typical, largely anonymous urban conditions of the modern world? Perhaps that close and revealing familiarity is far more likely to arise for many today with their co-workers and office mates than with their family and blood relations. At the very least, one is constantly reminded, think of The Office if you need to think of that kind of revelatory intimacy and entanglement of long mutual acquaintance. Most of you saw The Office in British and American vision.
Yeah.
That's TV series. Yeah, okay. So you got to know those people pretty well. At the very least, one is constantly reminded in attempting to penetrate these hadith of the ways in which the educational interpersonal effects of proper adab are of its lack. What my students would probably colloquially call the subtle inner workings of each person's karma are so much less visible and palpable in today's radically indifferent, relatively impersonal living circumstances. And again, I was just thinking, here you're going to be reading about hadith say, just address everybody, whether they address you or not, with salam alaikum, or better yet, salam alaikum, peace, God's peace be with you. I was just thinking of coming down Canal Street here. If you put that into practice, first of all, you'd never get past one block, because it might be a tremendous way for people to learn about Islam. I don't know, but you know, practicing the Hadith in such radically different circumstances than those in which they were recorded is a tremendous challenge. It means that we create new ways of being religious. We have to in the modern world. The same, again, this isn't just about Islam here. A great many prophetic hadith on these ethical and spiritual themes of proper adab, echoing what has just been mentioned above about their constant implicit Quranic background, insistently contrast the spiritual ideal of an active, operative awareness of the soul's truly lasting life, hayat al-akhirah, beyond this immediate lifetime, hayat al-dunya, the life that's closest to us or lowest, with all the formidable social, tribal, economic, and other attractions and pleasures of life in this world. These hadith are typically evoking something deeper and much more real and mysterious than a simple set of conscious eschatological beliefs, hypocritically ostensible professions which students are well aware from their own experience so often coexist in practice in any setting with the exact opposite of the spiritual ideals and practices actually being enjoined in these hadith. These striking sayings are among the many examples where the revealingly candid observations and actions and dramatic character and personality differences of very young children, less capable of hypocrisy and pretense, indeed equipped with a natural kind of natural straightforwardness or sit, can more immediately illuminate the deeply challenging teachings of such apparently otherwise banal hadith. One of the most strikingly unfamiliar yet pervasive qualities of the Prophet's advice in these hadith on adab, which you have now, is his frequent highlighting of the profound diversity and unavoidable individuality of each person's character and deep personality, their khalq or khulq, akhlaq, of the natural givens, of the inherent and often outwardly hidden weaknesses, strengths, and proclivities of each person. This is just to quote one of these. God Most High has allotted you your characters just as He allotted you your provisions, your rizq. He gives worldly things to those He loves and those He does not love. But He gives religion, deen, here in the sense of darda deen, only to those He loves. So he who has been given religion by God has been loved by Him. And deen here is the absolute inner truthfulness of our spiritual state, nothing outward to it. Given the Prophet's frequent allusion to these mysterious givens of character and outward circumstance alike, there is no notion here in the hadith of the individual as a tabula rasa, nor any imagined ideal of some hypothetical uniformity of inner and outer circumstance. Of course, these troubling acknowledgments themselves immediately raise serious metaphysical questions and considerations that take us back to the wider context of these issues in the Quran, as well as other openly metaphysical hadith. The one direct consequence of these observations is the Prophet's repeated intense emphasis on the necessity of deep inner modesty. That is not on one's never taking special pride in one's so-called achievements and accomplishments, and likewise in avoiding any inner attitude or outward expression of disdain, scorn, and dismissal of the apparent shortcomings of others. There should be no need to emphasize the rarity and difficulty of such challenging spiritual advice. Finally, many of these hadith and adab both presuppose and strongly insist on the necessity of our developing an active, vigilant awareness of who is really in control in this world. That is, of God's determinate qadr or taqdir. At the very least, this awareness would begin with a growing, this consciousness would begin with a growing awareness of the fundamental persistence and unavailability of apparent accidents, unexpected obstacles, failures, challenges, disasters, opportunities, miracles, and the like. That's quite a list. But what I find when I teach students is all of these elements of taqdir, you can see the positive ones in any Friday night rom-com, the latest week's, romantic, fated destiny of love movie. You guys still go to movies, or do you just watch everything on Netflix or whatever? But, and so I used to get my students to look at all these wonderful things that happen in life that are all beyond our power and yet transform our lives. But though I didn't usually focus on unexpected obstacles, failures, challenges, disasters, and the like, But those are just as much part of our top tier as all the wonderful things that happen. It's just we're the ones that decide they're not so wonderful. But without the contrast, we'd go nowhere spiritually. According to these hadith, all of these decisive events are precisely what repeatedly work to turn the complacently self-sufficient soul, the nafs al-amara, back to recognizing the deeper reality of its fundamental situation, as expressed in the hadith of the heart's constant turning between God's two fingers, the taqallub al-qalb, between, like the heart is a little P here, between God's two fingers. Thus, the essential principles of adab are repeatedly cast as spiritual, ethical ideals whose worldly costs and impracticalities are often openly highlighted in the hadith. Today, we are so used to the popular mediatic depiction of spiritual insights and practical disciplines from whatever tradition as effective tools enabling the facile acquisition of inner peace, control, prosperity, mindfulness, and other obviously desirable worldly outcomes, that these hadith may suggest some refreshingly different perspectives in which the ongoing repeated spiritual challenge of deep surrender of Islam, or taslim, is not entirely lost from sight. So before moving on to our handout of selected hadith and hadith adab, it is worth stressing that all these interpretive principles and conditions just briefly mentioned are not tied to any particular culture, religion, or historical context. Instead, the relevance and intrinsic credibility of these hadith and their teachings are deeply rooted in each person's experience of life, as pointedly expressed in the following well-known prophetic saying. It's reported by Ibn Abi from Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah. By the way, there's some unfamiliar names in these translations. They're either of the hadith collections or other people reporting them. And for anybody from the Muslim tradition, if somebody says Ibn Omar or Ibn Abbas or Huraira, actually you can just look up these names on the internet and explain how important, what the character and personality of these transmitters was. So I don't have to, I didn't put them in there for non-Muslim readers, but actually it's pretty easy to figure out who Ibn Omar was and just type it into Google. So instead, so this hadith, this saying is, whoever mixes with people and endures the harm they do is better than that person who does not mix with them and does not endure the harm they do. Now, if I stopped there, I'd be lynched, so let me go ahead. We're going to come back to that anyway. But before we turn to this, I had a kind of awakening watching the weather report this morning of an image that would tie this all together. And I'd like to just now make this more down to earth. You may never have seen the hadith, but it doesn't matter whether we're talking hadith or rabbinical sayings or the avot or anything from the Gospels or Buddhist, sayings or religious sutras or whatever. The same thing would be true of these intensely condensed spiritual teachings. We'll already have. Thank you for a second. Oh, okay. One or the other. Okay. Thank you. So, how do they work? Well, we don't usually think about this. We just learn them, especially if we started out as little kids. First thing to notice about hadith, they're not do's and don'ts. That's like people don't read them and don't understand them, or people who just study ilm al-hadith will don't do this, don't do that. There's almost no hadith that actually do that. They depict instead examples, and in particular there are dramas, I said before, of characters and how they are changed or how they seek to be changed. So the first thing is what I'm going to say here really has to do with the challenge of how do you get somebody to change their character. In Arabic, the word's really challenge, and the very word for ethical traits is the same word for the way we're created. Khalq, or khuluq, akhlaq. It's really, we're created a certain way. Everybody has a certain character. I hope everybody here has had a chance to spend a lot of time with relatively young children, because if you do, you'll never doubt how different every set of newlyweds thinks they're going to influence and shape their children and all. And the exact opposite will happen for the next 40 or 50, 60 years of your life. The shaping all goes in the other direction. I can say that from experience. This wasn't from the classroom. This is from more intimate relations. So there's a tremendous challenge with changing someone's character trait. Or there've got to be people here who've dealt with people who have problems with addictions. Actually, we all have problems with addictions. It's just some of them are more socially acceptable and less expensive than others are. But our character is in some way very closely related to those addictions that we spend our lives taking care of. And so breaking us of those, breaking through them, breaking beyond them is tremendously important. So how do the Hadith, or if you prefer any of these other scriptural elements, work with that? Well, first of all, and probably the most important, is people know them, but you can memorize them all, and you won't know anything more spiritually or anything more, there won't be any more change in you than if you'd not read them. The change comes from things that we usually don't see or usually aren't aware of. So the first one is, if we know some teaching like this, it only becomes meaningful to us in a situation that challenges us to actually live it. Okay? That may be obvious, but it's not obvious to people who think you can learn this in a classroom or of any sort, with religious classroom or otherwise. So we can know lots of them, but each one comes alive. It's like it's activated. You just kind of turn it on when life brings us the particular situation that relates to that particular, what term is usually called test, trial, bala, and so forth in the Quran. Doesn't matter what it's called, you know it when you're in it. The second one is that what happens is you can't, when you have this kind of awareness, and we'll have plenty of examples here, the first thing that happens is we begin to have an awareness, if we know the Hadith, we know the teaching, we begin to have an awareness of our shortcoming, of our deficiency, of our fault, of our misbehavior. So you don't start off by learning the Hadith and then magically putting them into practice. God, well, life would be almost automatic if we could do that, but anybody who thinks it works that way. It might, but if it works that way, it's for somebody who has another destiny and going to have a lot tougher tests down the road. The second thing is, after that initial discomfort of, oh my God, how far am I from living this Hadith, then it begins to awaken our conscience. This is a level of what the Quran calls the nafs al-lawama, the soul, the part of the soul that reproaches us, so that perhaps at that stage we can begin to stop doing the wrong things, stop doing the misbehavior, even though we quickly discover at the same time how much harder it is to put into practice. Because what's changed here, and what the Prophet is referring to, is not to behavior, it's to the intentions and the character and the spiritual being that underlies that behavior. So in every tradition, of course, there are lots of people who imitate the behavior, but that imitation will never get you to transformation. So then the next stage, and these are all stages I think everybody's here is well aware of, is that awareness of that hadith, or that ayah, whatever it may be, begins to help us open our soul to the inspiration of what we should be doing, and that usually happens automatically. The other things are kind of painfully conscientious, but ilham, the Quran, when it's this nafs al-mulhama, that's what we call it, the Quran says it's that part of our soul which inspires us what is good for us and what is bad for us. It's not good and evil. It's actually much more concrete. What is the good thing and the not so good thing in particular sets of circumstances? That's the nafs al-mulhama according to the Quran. Then, if we've had that for enough, one thing we begin to notice is that where you can really learn these things from is from, we begin to appreciate the living exemplars who've actually been living these things all along. One of the things I often do when we're doing a class in Sufism or Islamic spirituality, I'll ask them, the students, well, who have you known who's a real wali? Someone who really fulfills the descriptions of someone who's close to God, preferably somebody who's living, because you can't really test very well. And it's really interesting because I can remember long before I knew the word wali or the concept of walaya or anything like that, this is like, it's often mistranslated as saint, because how many people have ever met people with halos that you could see on the street? Probably not. It takes a little more effort, to do it. But I can really remember a couple of people I met when I took my, not Corey, but my first wife, I was about 18 years old, down to Texas to visit my mom's parents. And I met a couple of people from the backwoods, one couple sitting in their porch, another fellow was filling in for the preacher at the Southern Baptist Church. And long before I knew the word, the reality, anything else about the wali, it was like this preacher was teaching the Gospels not from any book. I remember my grandma always had the preachers over to Sunday dinner at her house. She was kind of the snob of the religious snob of the little town of Pagoda, Texas. God rest her soul. But she's one of these people who really knew all the scriptures, but there were other impediments there. But this fellow, he was just like doing and being what the Gospels were that ordinarily these people would just preach. And I knew plenty of people who preached the words but didn't have a clue as what they were about. And his whole time he spent talking, well, I never went to seminary. If I'm going to do this, I have to go to seminary. And even then, my wife was pretty spiritually astute. We both told him, seminary will ruin you. You will be destroyed by learning it. Awliya in general do not have need of madrasas and seminaries. They can help them, but the vast majority of them they do not. They learn from above, not from books and things. So that's something that comes as a further stage. And of course the final stage, and we're all at all these stages in regard to different aspects of our character and what we know of these teachings. Final stage, of course, is when we become the teacher, when we become the ones who are transmitting this teaching through our own example and practice. And now this is what I meant by the weather report, if I can get this image, because I imagine a lot of you have seen all these pictures of hurricanes from the satellite shots and all, have you? Some in the last month. It's hard to avoid them if you're watching anything about what's going on in the U.S. at least. But I'd like to start with the image of, which is what the Quran starts in a way, is the image of the breath, of the wind, the ruh. The wind is invisible, and this is the same image in the Bible, other places as well. But if our soul is nafesh, if it's a breath itself in relation to that wind, well, occasionally things come along. We can't see the wind or the self, but we can feel it rising. We can feel the wind even though we can't see it. So if you can start to think of our little soul here as a kind of water vapor that's dissolved in this dunya, and somehow this wind begins to come along and kind of raise it up. And those stages are this habitual awareness of our khala, of our weaknesses, of our conscience, of our inspirations. So as the soul is kind of raised up, it begins to become a kind of cloud, where it's maybe not because we're in it, it's what we are, it may not be visible to us, but it begins to become visible to those around us. And eventually, as that cloud is multiplied and learns through each of those hadith, kind of generates a different kind of, and cloud here has the positive Quranic sense of something that brings rain to those who are thirsty and starving and in need of the water of life, until eventually our soul begins to become a cloud that's raining on others. Not through consciously, just unconsciously raining on others. Well, if you now introduce the element of time here, what you'll see, the effect that these hadith or their like teachings have, is we begin to be raised up as clouds by each situation that we encounter in life. And actually those clouds don't go away. Once you've learned something spiritually, even if you may think your behavior falls back, but once you've truly learned it, you are transformed from that drop of water vapor into this kind of cloud that's going to have this influence on people. Well, what we can't see in this lifetime is that if you could just, kind of take your satellite shot of what's going on, is you notice how in those hurricane pictures, there's like, at first these things start out as, oh, it's really raining here, and it's really raining here, and there's that cloud there. And then gradually, as the whole thing begins to turn in a circle, what Yeats calls the widening gyres of life and of spiritual awareness, and as those clouds of what these hadith have awakened in us, as they begin to turn, this amazing thing happens, is it all becomes cloud, and yet we can't see it because we're in the cloud, and yet right at the center of it is this silent, still, centered point, which is the messenger from ourselves, the messenger to ourselves, the Rasul that's in ourselves, at the middle of ourselves. So I hope you can take that image, which you see all the time, and see it as a kind of image of how the Hadith gradually began to generate some. And look, there's another stage. As you take in more time, more generations and all, notice that the same image becomes the image. We tend to think of ourselves as a thing in time. So we think, oh, I'm just that water vapor in that cloud, or maybe that cloud or that cloud. But in fact, as we begin to look through time, we are being, that motion was always there. We just didn't perceive it, that circular and ascending motion, which both things happen in these hurricanes. So as it takes place over time, we have only the very slim notion of the ways in which our transformation is influencing the transformation of others, and the ways in which what, from our point of view, looks like somebody lived 2,000 or 1,400 or whatever years ago. We have no idea that their reality there is the axis, the center of that revolution, which is constantly bringing up new souls, new states of awareness, they're new from the point of view of the people in it, even though the circle of that kind of transformation and that arising, that mirage, is something that's going on all around us and that we're part of, and yet, for the most part, we can't see it. We can't get above it and we can't get out of it, except at rare moments of transformation that we all don't forget when we are given those kinds of moments of insight. So what I've given you is, in the handout, is a kind of, what was the Tom Petty thing? Learning to fly without wings? Yeah, that we were listening to. There's a lot of Tom Petty coming down in the car. And one of the really super songs there is where he's talking about learning to fly without wings. Well, he said, I'm learning to fly, but I don't have wings. But what you have in these handouts in the Hadith is about, 30, 25 flying lessons. So enjoy them, take them home, and work with them. Okay. So now it's up to you to make your comments and whatever you want to say about the conversation. So some of you had a good 15 minutes to work through some of these hadith. And I didn't want to read them out because it's really more interesting if you just almost pick one. If you do an I Ching with it, follow hadith, as if and find one that interests you, and we'll go from there.
I'm going to leap right in because
thank you for bringing us.
Be late. I'm going to be the first to leap in.
Which page
This
are we?
first one. A sound spiritual vision comes from God, and a normal dream from the shaitan. So when one of you sees what he likes in the dream vision, he must tell it only to someone he loves. But when he sees what he dislikes, he must seek refuge in God from its evil and tell not anyone of it. It will then not harm him. This is such an amazing teaching, and I'm fascinated by it, and because
well, coming from someone who has to interpret dreams for people, I assume.
Right. Yes. Well, as you say, you elevate or you interpret, and I'm just following the steps of my teacher. I'm thinking of Noor right now, Dr. Dixon, who always, one of his constant works was to elevate us. So we'd bring him something, tell him something, and he would see in it what was, a truth for us, and bring that out instead of what we thought, the more complainatory, pedestrian event. But here, what I see and what I'm working on constant, not constant, but continuous in a kind of overtime fashion, is that how we are creating, apart from the predestined ordainment, we are creating our destiny. Is that what it's saying? That because by saying the good and elevating the good, then that becomes our surrounding. But if we start, telling around, the bad things that we see in ourselves, then that just brings us down. I mean, I think that's a super important teaching.
Yeah, and there's a
What do
bunch
you
of other
think?
hadith here about
What?
that. There's a bunch of other hadith.
I'm sure. But what do you think of that? That because so much today in our culture, you know, we disparage others, but we disparage ourselves too. We kind of put ourselves down. It's a constant sort of, that's a bad habit.
Yeah.
Do you see that in your...
Yeah, I was going to just, and this is just by way of pointing out, because there's a whole one about bad-mouthing people and all. Let's see. Yeah, that starts at page 4. There's just a whole bunch of hadith about there. And what you really described, several of those say, some of them are dramatized with al-Farah, who's one of the very pious ascetics of the Prophet's circle, and so on, where things got so bad after the Prophet was gone that they just find him doing prayers in the mosque, and he says, well, at least I'm not going to harm anyone if I just stay here and pray in the mosque. Now, he cites a saying of the Prophet about all the things we should be doing, but in the era of the fitan, when anybody who stood up for something would be shot down and killed very quickly, you know, he found it most prudent to, that's the backdrop of that particular story. But I think what you've underlined there is that so many of these go back to the Quranic criticism of ghaibat, of saying bad things, or the Quran is probably harsher on that than anything else but pure kufr, or even yas, just despair, you know, is we should not ever, whether it's true or not, is utterly irrelevant. We should not say bad things about others. But it also goes this part, we should not be thinking bad things about ourselves. We had a long conversation, Corey, this is not about you, it's just about me, but we had a long conversation about this thing, about how we sell ourselves short in so many areas in life, as you were just saying, because, and that's why, you know, you really put us in that last hadith, you know, that if the only place we learn more about ourselves and the only place we can serve others is to interact with others, then why do we spend so much time hiding from others? Well, I mean, a lot of it is because it's very uncomfortable to admit what we don't know. We think all of our shortcomings, you know, what motivates that is our fear of all these shortcomings and weaknesses and ignorances that we all have. So, and I just say one thing about what your question ties together a good dozen of these different hadiths. So, so it's I don't have, my answer to that is, as an academic, I chose the occupation so I wouldn't have to deal with people. But this is what the Quran calls makarullah. I can only deal with books, which I can handle really, really well. But this is the makarullah because, in fact, you become a teacher, you're gonna be dealing with people all the time. And then I was never going to have kids either, and of course I had tons of kids and grandkids. So for those who aren't familiar with the Quranic expression, it just means, it often says that people are always trying to figure things out and make life safe and simple. And that God is the one who's, so when you said enacting our destiny, or you said creating our destiny, but of course we're kind of enacting the destiny which is part of our ayn, of our essential self that was known to God long before we figured it out.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can't oversimplify what we think our either destiny is or character, because you can keep moving, you know, otherwise there would be no movement.
Yeah, and above all, what happens when you try and not move?
Yeah.
I'm not asking you, this is right for everybody, but you say, oh God, this is so good. I just want to stay in this cool spot where I'm not being tested and everything's working out. You know, nowadays, when I have that thought, I just want to go pray, Alhamdulillah. You know, this is like I know something big is going to happen when I have that thought of how perfect things are. It's just, I'm just scared to death when I have that thought passes through my mind. Because we will be taught, you know. The teacher watches out for us, and the more we try and calculate, which is this makar idea, calculate how things will work in life. And that's why I started that account of how the hadith work, by emphasizing that we don't control that. You know, life brings up these sorts of moments where our challenges and our weak points and our opportunities, they're challenges both sides, opportunities both sides, you know. But we tend to think there's the good kind and the bad kind, but in fact, often it's the kind we don't want to see at all that turn out to be the most educational. And that's something that, I think somebody back there had that before you did.
Just wondered.
Maybe I was just looking that direction, but I'm sorry.
Thank you. I just wondered, is what is said bad, or is it the intent with which it is said?
Both. How many times, I can just ask in return, how many times have you been happy about something, immediately happy about something somebody said bad about you?
Hardly ever.
Yeah. In other words, and that reaction, it's very rarely the intent. I mean, about the only person I was sure of their intent was my sister when I was growing up. That was not good. By the way, mine wasn't good back either, but that relationship was the fruit of lots of bad saying back and forth. It was like
I guess you could move that into one's interior and wonder how one should look at one's own self-criticism. Is one being destructive in looking at oneself critically, or is one trying to move beyond one's flaws?
Well, we've got psychologists in the room, more than one, I hope, who would talk about where those nuffs, those kinds of things come up in us and what generates them. But I think it's a positive way of looking at your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're asking a question that really everybody here is asking, I think, if we properly appreciate that. I think, have you ever noticed something in life that I've noticed? Whenever something bad happens in life, my first reflex is, and this may be an intellectual's thing, but my first reflex is to try and understand the causes of it in the hopes that knowing the causes will help me to avoid that pain again. And it never, it's an automatic response that never works. Because, I mean, unless, I think we think that there's a lot of risks associated with opening up about where we're hurt by other people, or where, one of the things that we rarely do, for example, when someone does that kind of thing, is come back to the person and say, did you realize what you just did? And again, I'm fortunate to have students because they will come and give me a tongue lashing for something I did unconsciously in the class. It happens every few weeks, something. And usually it was a well-intentioned anecdote or something like that. But so I think that the chances of paying attention to those things and then responding to them in a positive way are much less dangerous. We all know there are people who have such, they're so out of control at different points in life that they maybe need to censor themselves. But in terms of the vast proportion of encounters I have with people I meet, I think the censoring of one's weaknesses and bad reactions and things like that, by censoring I just mean turning them inside and attacking ourselves about them rather than working on them and getting past them to go ahead with life. That was why I mentioned that example, trying to understand the bad things that happen, because that's not how we learn. And so, but as I said in that, towards the end of the talk there, character is something we're not stuck with permanently, but something we have to work with. And it's maybe we can see it as our tool, as a tool and instrument that's given us to see things. First of all, it gives us a lot of compassion for others. That happens almost automatically when we encounter these situations. But yeah, I'm thinking, how many times are we ever really endangered by what people say? My mom, who was pretty wise, she'd always, have all these sticks and stones, kinds of sayings and things like that, because I was a painfully shy little kid, barely step out of the family, go to the grocery store was a trauma, and yet, that if we live our lives that way, we're not going to learn a great deal. We might find things very comfortable. There's probably more the psychologists could tell you the response to that, but they can talk after the discussion.
So my first just was thought, the question of we see something that hurt us and do we go back and figure out why, or do we try to rise above it? And the concept, Jewish concept of a chit, which is we just celebrated Yom Kippur. We look back on the year and we take a look at what we could have done better.
Yeah.
How can we improve? How did we miss the mark? And how can we get closer to the mark?
Same
going
word,
forward?
same word in the Quran.
Yeah, really. And so, and in that regard, following up on what Sheikha mentioned, and you talked about being drops in a storm, in manifesting our destiny, it is not only our personal, but it is our collective. So we look not just to ourselves, but to the community of drops. And how do we make it better? How do we collectively, more effectively work to manifest our collective destiny?
Yeah, that's why in the translation of that ayah, I put anfusakum as yourselves, souls. There's a historicist way of reading it where this is only meant for the people of the Prophet's time, and therefore yourselves means your little group, in-group at that time. But it's very important spiritually to read it as both selves and souls in the plural, because the plural there in Arabic, because it's as we form these clouds and we rise through them, we ride it constantly in our interactions with others. And as I said, we hardly know the tiniest bit of the actual interactions that are moving us. Of our destiny is, that little bit of our destiny we think we know and control is always, it's comforting, but it's not complete, you know.
Hi. You said that to look at each hadith, we have to have a wholly integrated awareness with the Quran.
Ideally.
Yeah.
I didn't say everybody has that.
It was a very beautiful way to craft, something. So I read a hadith a long time ago, and I found out which book it's in, Tirmidhi. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that you can accept the narrations of the Jews and Christians as authentic. And I don't think everyday Muslims operate theologically that way.
Although, in regard to so many of the allusions in the Quran, if you didn't, most of the kisses of Anbiya would be.
Right, so I feel it encourages us to look at the, not only the stories, but the commentaries of the Jews and Christians. And the Christians of the time would have been what we call Catholics today, because there was no schism, even of 1054.
Well, first of all, they'd be Orthodox.
Right, well.
Which, I don't want to step anybody's toes here.
Right, so that was in 1054. Islam was 6. So I want to say the Hadith brings me ironically closer to Jewish and Christian traditions of the time. Do you find that's a good way, that's good context for it?
Am I still being recorded? That's certainly my experience, but I've spent my life in religious studies, and I'm now in theology department. So the similarities, like you said, the Hebrew, you begin to see as you learn about other traditions, what they have in common becomes more and more obvious, and what they have in common includes not only the spiritually useful or beneficial. Am I still?
Yeah, you're on.
I'm on? Okay. But also dangers and pitfalls that are shared within each tradition are also found in the others. And by the way, there are a good number of other hadith supporting the point of we learn from other people, and these kinds of disagreements or disagreeability that we learn from. As I was translating these hadith this time, the ones on adab, I was thinking, how much of this do I practice with regard to our president? Not much. I mean, frankly. I'm not sure how that proper practice would look, but we all know people who are very, who we find difficult to deal with, who we tend to push away in various ways, where in fact they may be teaching us how we should I'm not saying that it's not about the opinions of the other, it's about the reactions we have to another, that person that's disagreeable. And that's, again, I go back to that Ibn Omar saying there that I found so powerful, is that if we just pick to live our lives with people we agree with us and we agree with and all, it might seem superficially easier, but we learn less. And that's all I can say, really, because I think in general in life, we learn from the lessons that are given to us to learn, that are imposed on us in a certain way. So discovering our destiny or creating our destiny is always a dance. You know, it's like when you first dance, you're going to step in your partner's toes. You know, think of the ballroom type dancing or something like that. Anybody here? Some people are laughing. They must remember when we did that kind of thing. And you know, dances are. I'm not talking about dances that are solitary, but I'm talking about the dance between who we are and what we discover our destiny to be. And I love, and the way you learn to dance in part is to communicate with your partner. Well, we call that communication with our partner prayer. And I always loved Hafez's image when he talks about dua. It's like you're dancing with somebody much, you know, and if you can sort of imagine, I think it was at Patsier or somebody at one of those gatherings that pointed that out, that somebody was relatively short and had spent a lot of time trying to dance with someone who was much taller. Well, God is much taller, you know, so dua is our munajat, all those forms of prayer are our interaction, our learning to dance through our destiny in a way that really, because the music is so important in life, and that's what I said, this big picture is the music, and if we can hear the music, we're not going to step on toes at least, you know, and that's already a huge plus.
If we hear the music?
If we hear the music, we're not going to, you know, when do little teenage boys, why do they start dancing on their partner's feet? Because they're not listening to the music. They're so obsessed with, at last I'm close to a girl, you know, all that kind of stuff, you know. And it just drives them wild, you know, so the music is lost. I'm sorry, I can still remember when I was a teenager. You're going to have to forgive. Don't think that people who talk about these things weren't teenagers once. So, yeah, so.
If we can hear music.
You okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I just have a question going off a little bit of what you were just saying before. If, for example, you don't like something or you think somebody did something wrong, and you notice it, and you don't want to respond likewise in a bad manner, but also the other option would to be like, say, I mean, ideally you would respond well, but if, what's worse, like to be silent or to respond badly?
Notice that is entirely situational. It's just a perfect example of a situation that raises, there are two kinds of hadith that, well, there's things in the Quran, but one of the things that I emphasized here were hadith about what in Islam is called being sattar, because as-sattar, the one who veils, is one of the divine names. So when you're a kid and you learn good and bad at school or church, synagogue, mosque, whatever, your immediate reaction in that case is to start going around telling on people.
Right.
When
And
you're
what's good and
8,
bad.
7, 8,
Right.
9, whatever, you know. I said, I don't think I use gender there, you know, because I think it's pretty common with both genders. And with time, you learn, and this is, does anybody know what page the one in being Sattar is? Well, I want to find the actual passage so people can. Page 5, middle, top 5. Okay, there it is, yeah. Controlling your tongue, you know, so many of these things are, in Persian, a lot of these sayings have to do with what's called nikubui, only saying what is good of other people.
Right.
And nikbini, seeing other things as good, and
Right.
not seeing everything as good, but seeing the things that are good in the world, and nikhahi, wishing the good for others. So what's situational in those contexts? Now, you know, obviously, no, it's at one extreme that people are going to do horrible things. You go to the police, and, you know,
Right.
make sure they don't set off their bomb. That's rarely the case. But on the other hand, there are all these hadith about letting people learn their spiritual lessons through their interaction with God. In other words, you don't make anyone better by catching them at something. So the prophet is looking at things from the point of view of, because everybody has an endless variety of huts. It's okay, hut in Arabic, you know. So what the prophet is doing using his hadith is not thinking about the social level of interactions, but he's talking about places with people who already get along socially. He's talking about what is it that's going to favor the spiritual growth of the other person. Now, for a 7-year-old, 10-year-old, that's very hard, perhaps, for them to see. But as we get older in life, you know, it's not hard, I think, whatever example you're thinking of, to realize that we tend to become much more deeply understanding of people's motives or what they do, and of letting them deal between themselves, letting them deal with the consequences of what they are doing. What I find as a teacher and interacting with, you know, but not so much the classroom, but traveling around the world and talking to different audiences, is a lot of people have the idea that if we kind of had an omniscient, God is kind of an omniscient policeman, that everybody could be made to be good. And so we will create a government that can make sure that people can't do bad things and that they can only do good things. What's wrong with that fantasy? So it drives all sorts of political ideologies since, well, long ago, but especially in the last 2 centuries when people actually feel they can remake society. What's wrong with being the corrector of other people?
It comes
from the outside. Yeah, okay, but I mean, I wanted to ask.
I'm a little bit I'm confused by the question slightly.
Well, you were asking this question of how do we know when to...
Oh, what's wrong with telling somebody that they did something wrong?
So, there,
I mean, I might...
it is really situational. There may be... Look, if it's your kid,
Right.
you're not going to hold back, right?
They don't have kids.
Well, no, but I mean, in general, people don't hold back.
Right.
But if it's your... if it's somebody who's close to you, but who's not... you don't have a lot of responsibility over their lives, for example, you may destroy a friendship, you may destroy a marriage, you may destroy a business. You know, you have to think about the consequences of what you do when you expose.
Right.
This is what the prophet's talking about here. So every situation requires you to kind of develop as broad an understanding and as you can of the situation, both on the worldly level and the consequences. But what I didn't get to finish my thought about doing this in politics, is people who want to do that, they've completely ignored the fact that from the point of view of the Quran, there's one person who's in charge of correcting all of these things and making sure that the people who do something wrong in some way or another pay for it and move on, or that the people whose good is buried and they're troubled and all that they work out in the long run. Who's in charge of that justice in the world?
I mean, of course.
Well,
I mean,
of course.
in general, I would always agree with you, but I just lately have been thinking about that silence itself is a choice. So,
It is a choice. That's what the prophet is saying here.
and you think that
all depends. It all depends on the context. I wouldn't want to be able to give those lessons to someone else. I'm just saying that the world is so filled with injustices and people who get away with things,
Right.
that if you either begin, the purpose of that in part is to make us aware that the world we can see is a tiny part of the world that exists, that there is a spiritual world, that there is a world beyond, that the fate and destinies of souls and the way we pay for what we do wrong or we learn from it and so forth, it's not all visible in front of us, because half the verses in the Quran basically are about a world that's bigger than this world, about a world that's beyond this world. So if we don't take those things seriously, then for sure we want to make sure we get everything corrected and fixed right here and now. And there's a kind of Sisyphean quality to that we're all aware of in those times when we take over something and we want to fix it completely. I suspect everybody's here has had something like that. You know, that we could live other people's lives better than them. No? I think at different points we all think that. So I can't answer your question, but I can say that the question itself comes from the place at which we begin to learn about these things. And look, if you get it wrong, let's say, look, if you get it wrong and you don't correct something in someone else, what happens?
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes I do think
take the
sometimes we
tool.
have certain people in our lives, like, at a certain point you should say something.
Yeah, of
Like,
course. But
This, I just keep, now that you're like talking, I just keep thinking of the Martin Luther King quote. I can't remember exactly. Can you, that's like,
yeah,
the
but,
bad things or the bad people or the silence of your friends.
but all I'm saying, if we get either side wrong, either we try and correct something and much more worse harm comes of it, or we correct it and let's see what happens was correcting the other. We don't do it and bad things happen. In both those cases, we're going to learn something, right?
Right.
We'll learn what we should have done. But notice that there's no simple rule there. There's no simple rule there. Not the word some rule, but it's simple. Because what the prophet is saying is that we should be aware of the processes by which people learn, the processes by which people grow. And one of the most dramatic examples, you can see how this works, is we all know people who raise their kids with like the ruler and the whip. I mean, doesn't matter what religion it is. I think maybe I'm using images from my day, nuns with their rulers, and dads with their belts, and things like that. But generally, the people who do that so that they can never do anything wrong without getting punished, what do the kids kind of grow up?
Yeah.
Were they what?
They grow up wild instead.
Probably, or they beat up on themselves in the way the man next to you was saying, or whatever. So yeah, that's all. It's stay with the question, and you'll learn from however you answer it. You know, I'm just saying that when I first encountered this notion of God as a satar, and that is a positive spiritual virtue, I was raised in a strict Protestant environment, and it was all about correcting other people. You know, so what? You know, let them get away with this crap. You know, and politically and ethically and personally and all. So it was really shocking to me. When I was living in Iran, and I began to see, you know, have a spiritual teacher who kind of, you know, it's just approached life differently in a broader perspective over time. How we learn from our mistakes. And I thought if you made a mistake and you got caught at it, you were out the window of that tariqa. You just threw yourself out. You know, but that isn't the way sheikhs work all the time. I have no idea what goes on here. But generally, rahmah is the primal source and mercy and loving mercy, compassion are the very source of being, and so sheikhs usually turn out to manifest that at what must be the hardest part of their job, which is this individual counseling of this or that person when they're facing the kind of situations you're facing. By the way, when I spend some time with someone, it's not, I hope you don't feel like getting bogged down. It's just you're saying something that we all wrestle with. That's why that's what we're sticking with it.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to introduce an additional way between silence and correcting or telling, being the one who knows better.
Yeah.
And that is exploring, being curious about, wondering with the other, whether it is one other, the community other, the world at large other, because that opens up so much of what I think you've been talking about.
Yeah, your question really goes back to, again, I didn't get first name, but you were Latif's subtle question there, or subtle comment about that, because that's a good, what you just said is a good example of how very often when kids are very attached to some form of religion that they're raised in, you know, they'll find everybody else dangerous and false and so forth about that. So there are people who grow up and they still keep that attitude, whereas hopefully most people learn from those that they can learn from as they get older. So, but it also doesn't mean that some people have different capacities of it. It's amazing how often the prophet alludes to this, that we have to take into account. People are in different situations, they have different capacities, and they learn in different ways and so forth. So almost, yeah, what you're saying is that there are many different ways to learn, there are many different ways to communicate, to, what I always think, if I stop and think, what illustrates what you're talking about is to look at how the different sheikhs, masters, guides that I've dealt with, how they have dealt with me, or other people that I know well enough to know. And it's always with a kind of understanding that's so much bigger than my very limited ego can take in. But I can recognize that it's beyond my ego's ability to handle these things. And and again, academia, it's like you get ahead in academia by disproving and pointing out the fallacies of other scholars. You know? So like academia is like one of those really good lessons of how not to be in life. You know, basically, you know, we should do the opposite, you know, but nobody's going to publish a paper in which you say, boy, you know, I really loved what all my professors said, you know. And they got it published like, you were wrong here and wrong there and completely wrong about this. So that's the way that it works, but it's just please ask questions too about what you've got in front of you.
Not so much a question as just a connection to what you were saying earlier about being the rain in the cloud, raining, and that if we are working on that and being that, then oftentimes all it needed is just sitting and holding a space for somebody, and that reflection and that rain is what causes a shift more than anything you could say. I was just inspired by that.
And that's what I've tried to get across talking about these hadiths, is that they not only require reflection, they're kind of made, you know, for that particular purpose. Just like that wonderful question about where do we find the balance point there. And yeah, so that's precise. You know, if you summed up a lot of the points I made in more detail, that would be that it's not about the hadith, it's about the way they help us to be aware of how we have to constantly be reflecting on what's happening to us in life. Because if you put these into practice, there's never a dull moment. You know? I mean, even a few of them. I mean, I just, you know, there are thousands and thousands of hadith. I just gave you like 20 or 25 to look at. So, but what the opposite of thinking or reflecting about those would be the kind of, this is what God says, do this, don't do that, or whatever. And most of the people who talk about hadith that way have never really tangled with them. They might have had a teacher who said, do this, don't do this, because it's in the hadith. But then you sort of wonder, I have a colleague who said something about iconoclasm in Islam the other, you know, in a paper that was just sitting out with a copier, you know. And I thought, here, should I go correct her that she's completely wrong? You know, she's a law professor. You know, nothing that important. This is really your example there. Of correcting my colleague who's sort of saying, oh, in Islam it's all iconoclastic, no portrayals of living beings allowed of any sort, and don't know where she got the idea, but somewhere off the internet probably, the source of all evil. But these things are all ignorance. But you know, should I go tell her and straighten her out? You know, so not a close colleague either. But I think that's, you know, but if you read a hadith in which the Prophet is saying, somebody walks in a house and somebody has a gold garment with depictions of angels on it, and he says something about, you know, there's no room for this in this house. Well, the word house in the hadith is so often the soul. And, you know, there's no room for idols in the soul, you know. Or some of the things that are said about dogs, to justify dogs being unclean, you know. And you look at the actual hadith, and there, you know, this is constant. I just alluded to this kind of hadith where it's a kind of fake news literalism about, I'm sorry to use the jargon of our day, but where you know, where people just take it, or like, I remember, like I mentioned, I was embarrassed to mention it in Sauce, but I came out, you know, somebody saying I had a gold wedding ring on and saying, oh, haram, haram, you know, like, you know, takfir, you know, so why, it's a Western custom to wear a wedding ring because you're married, you know. But you go and see what the Prophet says about gold, and it's pretty harsh, but it's also clearly in a context where what is in question is ostentatious display of wealth. And ostentatious display of wealth, well, that in the modern world is kind of like the universal vice, anybody who has some, So, and I'm not picking on any real estate magnates or anything like that, but just, but wearing a wedding ring is not what the Prophet was forbidding. I'm sorry, I'm going to stand by that even if some people want to hunt me down, but...
Effendi would always, Mr. Effendi always had a big gold watch, so everyone...
Very obviously, so it bring those people out of the woodwork. But boy, when the person sort of whacked me over the head with that the first time, and somewhere in Iran back 40 years ago, we were off there, but those kinds of reading the Hadith that way are really, they're unfortunate, so we say. Sometimes they're scary, sometimes, but I think that scares people away. One of the subtexts here of this talk was just that in a traditional Muslim society, the Hadith permeate all these rituals and things that I mentioned at the beginning, so you don't really have to ever learn them because they're there in people's behavior, in people's lives, and so forth. That's the best way to learn them. But I have so many students today who have none of that adab and that tradition and that education. So the question for each of us is, how do we communicate with each person for whom we're responsible for teaching and guiding in life? And anybody who knows my problems with my kids knows that I'm not talking as a master here. I'm talking as somebody who wrestles with these things. So, yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to say something regarding what Amina was bringing up, and also reflecting back to this hadith here. Abu Hurairah reported that God's messenger said, "Each of you is the mirror of his brother. So if he sees any fault in him, he should wipe it away from him." So what I'm hearing here is that when you see a fault in your brother, to actually look for that in yourself and wipe it away from you.
She's right. It doesn't mean that you can't correct people in the proper way. But you have to do it. The Quran has these proviso phrases that I want to bring in here because nobody pays attention to them. And one of those big ones is fi sabilillah, or another is billadhi, asan. It's like in the path of God, or with what is best or most appropriate, or what most beautiful, perhaps. So there are all sorts of ways that parents learn with children or teachers with their students where you can correct somebody and they don't even know they're being, in regard to these kinds of things. So I mentioned the Quran there because this is so often the case in the Quran, that there are these, it's the intention, if your intention in doing these things is not to prove somebody wrong, not to say I'm better than you because I noticed this in you, but if your intention is to, like you would with a friend that you want to avoid, like walking up in front of a bus, you want to avoid something like that. When you've got an intention like that, you can say almost anything. It isn't in the words, it's in the intention. So
No, actually what I was referring to
I
is
know, and you're talking about taking even a further step of seeing it as applying to yourself.
and then if you see it as applying to yourself and you wipe that away in yourself, then does it actually help your brother?
It does so much good that your brother will want to be around you twice as often. Yeah. I mean, that's the way these things work. Because after all, how many, gosh, Corey, I know I was going to mention you, but this can't be untrue of other people too, that we spend a lot of time talking about our present government, in various ways. Okay, well, we're good ourselves away here. Wasted time, probably. But truth is, if you see something that's wrong, it almost always is something. There's something there that one has to, it may be that you have to take more action than you're doing rather than just talking about things in words. It may be, but the important thing there is, I think, by the way, that hadith is always, people call it al-mu'min miratul mu'min. And then you'll see all these things about, well, the the person who has faith is an image of God, is and all. It's very social. It's very down to earth. The actual Hadith, as you quoted it there, and yeah, that's a good example of how we constantly see things that we can work on when other people trouble you. Can I take another concrete example of that? It has to do with my commute to work every day. Because in Boston, they're the most, if you want to know what heedlessness looks like, drive through Boston. You know, it's like ghafla. It's like, you know, and I get mad. Every day I see something that makes me angry. You'd think after 10, 11 years there that I would have gotten over this. But, you know, you tell me, what can I do to deal with that weak point of my character, which is the desire to correct Boston's Jahiliya driving skills, you know? You know? And we laugh, but I mean, it's scary sometimes. You know, you didn't know that New Yorkers are really law-abiding, did you? You know, until you got up to Boston, drive through Boston, and you'll
Just
see.
remember driving in Tehran.
Yeah.
And you'll think the Boston drivers are great.
But they would survive in Tehran. You know, they would survive. They would that pretty quickly. Yeah, right. It's not quite as crowded as Tehran, but yeah. So no, I'm trying to think of what the right way is to respond to that, because again, I waste a lot of time and energy on that kind of where you
What
can't.
about gratitude that you survived and everyone has survived?
Yeah, and it gives me a lot of teaching points for my students in their classes.
Oh, that's
you know.
important.
Yeah. I mean, non-controversial ones.
I remember reading one hadith in a Tirmidhi, I think, I felt was a little distressing to me. And the hadith said something along the lines of, you know, one person can do, you know, many good actions throughout their life, but if God, you know, has it that they die a non-believer, and I'm not saying this word for word, but it's along those lines, you know, then that person dies a disbeliever or you know, just
Catholic or whatever.
yeah, and then someone could do bad actions throughout their life, and then but God had imprinted that they're, you know, a believer or that sort of thing. And then you said something similar when you said something about someone who has deen, and that meaning someone who has a real connection or, you know, is on a path to God, and that's because God loves that person. It's not something outward. So I was, you know, I was wondering if you had any comments on those hadith.
No, and as far as this, not directly, but as far as the second one, basically about 1 in every 5 pages of the Gospels is about these kinds of stories that Jesus tells about our surrender to God, our taslim, our awareness of God and the transformation it brings about, is always available to everyone. And he got in a lot of trouble for saying that, you know. And I remember as a little kid, one reason I probably ended up teaching in religion is I was a very rationalistic little 6, 7, 8-year-old. So I read things like that. Okay, I didn't read them in the Hadith, but I read them in the Gospels, and it was just like seemed so unfair. You know, like I was just outraged. And now we're doing the Book of Genesis. It's true of all sorts of bad people in the Hebrew Bible, so not for all sorts of good things happen to bad people and vice versa. So the first thing to notice, as far as the first one, is we've got all sorts of literary examples and examples in life where that clearly happens with people, that they've led very good lives. And something comes along that pushes them into despair or into hubris or into, you know, grandiosity, and they do things that... So you don't have any trouble seeing how that can happen. The mystery here is, why does it happen? And there are lots of ways of answering that. That's why when I talked about these kind of medical questions about our destiny, about why we're given the character we are with its weaknesses, its strengths, and the people around us that are given around us, why that is, the Quran has lots to say about that, but that takes us in a, how should I say, a speculative direction of how we interpret things about destiny and God's role in the Quran, and in Hadith that are metaphysical. But I think that ability to, that sense that the doorway of repentance is always open. I got this fellow's been Yom Kippur back there nodding, you know. It's like, and actually this year we had Yom Kippur and Ashura were the same day, literally. It's like talk about repentance and people being saved and not saved and things like that, when it happens in the same day, it's pretty powerful. But, but would you really want it to be any other way? See, I think the thing is, we imagine, and underneath this comes back to our eschatological imagination, we imagine that like there's like a switch here, saved, not saved.
Right.
But the Quran doesn't say that. It indicates there are endless mansions, 7 jannats, 7 fires, and so forth. So they're endless, and it talks constantly about the darajat, and the hadith that are about that, like talk about the darajat. So once you begin to see that this isn't like flunking or passing in life, but that it's about learning quickly or learning slowly, and raising the question about what are the contexts that God gives us in which to learn. If we can open up to those as possibilities, then we don't have to see it as flunking and passing. We can begin to see that God's mercy is infinite. And I must say about half the films I show in my inner class are about this question of the infinity of God's mercy and forgiveness, and whatever religion we're working on at the time. So is that, I would just say kind of, again, we have to get higher and we have to expand in order to get our heads around what the prophet is actually teaching. And that never stops. I mean, because who's going to claim that they've got the inside track there? I'm sorry I have to face these people.
Knowing about films, have you seen Eunice Emery?
Well, we got it up on our Netflix
Yes,
watch list.
there's so much teaching about Adam, and I keep wanting to shake to correct someone who's doing something wrong and he doesn't, and I get frustrated.
Yeah, okay.
He just lets them go along, and,
Yeah, but
and he knows
that's
they're
a
going
good,
to
that's a good example.
slowly learn in their
It's
own way.
our daughter and son-in-law who told us we got to watch that. It's queued up there, ready to go.
Really good.
It's worth seeing.
It's really, really good.
Eunice Emery, by the way, for those who don't know, is one of the great Urafa or awliya of the Turkish Sufi tradition, or maybe beyond. Anyway, I don't mean Sufi in a narrow sense, but yeah. And a poet. I mean, he's the Turkish equivalent as a poet of Rumi, for sure. So, the Turkish language.
Speaking of movies, we wanted to, my wife and I watched the movie that when you came last year, you had recommended, and you talked about it, Jacob's Ladder.
When you spoke about Barzakh.
When you spoke about the Barzakh.
Yeah.
And it really stayed with us for a while, especially with my wife.
It's an adult spiritual movie. There are some of those that are too hard for 20-year-olds, but I'm glad you benefited from it.
And we agree with you that it was marketed as a horror movie, but it's so beyond that. It has nothing to do with it, really. It's weird.
Our standards are way out of whack. Life is the horror movie, But I think, we were in a film last night where nowadays there's nothing on the previews because it's close to Halloween, but horror movies there. And I thought, why, all I can figure out is why do people go to those? But it's kind of to inoculate them maybe against fears that are deeper and harder to deal with, because I've never understood the appeal, but it's obviously very lucrative business.
It could be the subject of a book.
What?
This topic.
Yeah. Now my students think these books are all from ancient history. I mean, these films that I use are all as old as the scriptures. That was from 1987. And, Ingmar Bergman, who was kind of the religious filmmaker of my generation, nobody's clue, it's like, at least, just as Volvo became Chinese, Ingmar Bergman disappeared as a commonplace religious filmmaker. So anyway, take these, I don't know where we are in terms of time, but if you can benefit from these, hold on to them, take them home. Where's Farah? You'll have them up on a website or something?
Yeah.
If you lose this, or you have a friend who you can share it with.
Any other questions?
It's 2 hours. Well, it's not actually 2 hours.
I just wanted to correct myself, the pronunciation is Chet, C-H-E-T, but they're different spellings, so.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I sometimes wonder why teaching, I have to teach Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and I'm all the time mentioning all these words that they're the same between Hebrew and Arabic, basically minor differences. And I'm never sure whether they're like students there who kind of want to attack me for that or whatever, but I'm hoping it diffuses this kind of closed-mindedness that people have, that you can begin to see how much the sacred scriptures have in common. And of course, you can't understand the New Testament without Jesus having that all in his background. Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't get to tell a story about my kids at all tonight. I usually stick one in there, but my daughter went to confirmation class, Catholic school, her mom was there, thanks. And her first question for the priest was, if Jesus was Jewish, why aren't we? And he said, come back at 18, I'll give you a full answer to that question, but for now, get away from all my other students. So I thought, this is like a prophetic insaf, you know, he knew how to deal with her and to deal with his other 8th graders, and you know, that's kind of the question of, you know, how you talk to different audiences in different ways. But unfortunately, she never went back. I wish she had.